Hey, welcome back to 1P3 here on Reason and Theology. Louis Dizon segment on the channel. He is continuing with his Bible study through the scriptures. We're now on the book of Isaiah, which is one of my most favorite books in the Old Testament. So I really look forward to this one. They call it the fifth gospel because it has so many things in it that point to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so I'm really excited about this. Louis, welcome back to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's been pretty crazy last little while.
Yeah.
So, been juggling a lot of different things. And also, we were just talking about this backstage. And a bunch of you who follow me on social media already know this. But for those who are not in the know, I actually just got engaged recently. So,
Congrats.
um,
Congrats.
yes,
Big
thank you very
news.
much.
That is
Yeah,
awesome.
I'm juggling that along with
Mhm.
this and everything else, but God willing, I'm gonna try to continue churning out the same quality content as always while doing, what I need to do.
Yeah, my wife and I
But
were
yeah,
on Facebook and we saw your video engagement and we're really excited for you. So congrats.
thank you very much. So
Yeah,
yes, for all those listening, please keep me in your prayers
absolutely.
as we prepare our
Absolutely.
marriage plans.
Absolutely.
So with that out of the way, I'm ready to dive right in to
Let's do
this.
it. Okay, yeah, if you want to
Okay,
share your screen.
yeah, so let's pull up the verbum.
Hmm.
And I realize not everyone who listens to this necessarily is looking at the screen. Maybe you're using a podcast app, which means you can't see what I have on the screen. So I'll try to describe it as best as I can. So the book of Isaiah is one of the meatiest books in the Old Testament from a theological standpoint. And Michael is right. This is the fifth gospel in many ways. And for my Catholic colleagues and brethren, one of the fun facts that some of you may already know, maybe some of you don't, is in our lectionary, um, you know how we have an Old Testament reading every Sunday. The book of Isaiah is actually the most frequently featured book of the Old Testament in the Missal. So the Old Testament reading will more often than not be from the book of Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah is actually featured in the lectionary more often than the Gospel of Mark. That is how prominent it is there, which is why all the priests, when you prepare your homilies, make sure to do an in-depth study of this book, and it will yield a lot of treasures. And I'll do as best as I can to describe some of those treasures. So we're going to dive into the historical background of this book. And I'll focus in particularly on the question of how many authors does this book have exactly, because you may hear of like second Isaiah or third Isaiah, and is that an actual thing? And we'll also look at the messianic prophecies of this book, because this book, more than any other, has so many messianic prophecies in it, especially the most famous one, Isaiah 53, which honestly could be a whole episode in and of itself. So this will only be a cursory overview. So let's start by looking at what the very first verse of Isaiah is so that we can get a little background. And once again, I'm using the ESV Catholic edition for this. Um, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So, right there, we have a firm timeline. We can more or less date when those four kings reigned, which was around the late 8th and early 7th centuries. Um, and according to rabbinic tradition, his prophetic ministry also spanned the beginning of King Manasseh's reign, which began just after the book of Hezekiah. In fact, there is a tradition that Isaiah was actually martyred by King Manasseh. Legend has it that Manasseh wanted Isaiah put to death, and Isaiah feared for his life and hid in a tree. And Manasseh had that tree sawed in half and Isaiah was sawed in half along with it. And this tradition is reflected in the New Testament. A lot of people don't realize this, but it is actually this episode that I just mentioned is alluded to in Hebrews. So in Hebrews 11, you have the Hall of Fame of all the great Old Testament figures, and there are many who are not mentioned by name. So in verse 37, there's a mention here where it says, "They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword, they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated." Now, make note of that phrase, sawn in two. A lot of people do not know what this is a reference to. But if we assume that the author of Hebrews was familiar with the rabbinic tradition of Isaiah being killed by Manasseh by being sawn in two, it is quite likely that that is what Hebrews is referring to here, which indirectly gives credence to that specific tradition. That doesn't mean that every rabbinic tradition about every biblical figure is necessarily correct, but it does mean that this particular tradition is correct, and Hebrews gives its rubber stamp on it. Now, when we're talking about the events of Isaiah's life, it's important to make note of those four kings that are just mentioned, because we will see that this was a very important time politically for the kingdom of Judah. So you may remember when we were discussing the books of First and Second Kings that the monarchy had been divided between Israel to the north and Judah to the south, and this was a time when Israel was not on friendly terms with Judah. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 7, it is mentioned that Israel allied with Syria against Judah. So in Isaiah chapter 7, it says this: "In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told, 'Syria is in league with Ephraim,' the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind." Now, the reason for this alliance of Israel and Syria was that this was the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and a lot of the states to the west of the Euphrates were afraid of Assyria's rise into power, so they launched sort of an anti-Assyrian league to combat them, and Israel and Syria were the two main kingdoms that were part of this league, and they wanted Judah to become part of this league as well, but Judah chose to be neutral in that conflict. And the idea was that Israel and Syria wanted to depose King Ahaz and install a king in Judah that was more friendly to their league. So in verse 6, we read, "Let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabil as king in the midst of it." So this son of Tabil is presumably a more pro-Israel, pro-Syria king who would be more willing to join their league. Now, they do not succeed in conquering Judah, and in fact, um, shortly after this, Israel is wiped out. So we know that in 722 BC, Assyria completely wipes the northern kingdom off the face of the earth and disperses the 10 tribes. And this is particularly important because then it is in that context that we get the Emmanuel prophecy, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Now, this is not the end of Assyria, because as we learn later on, Assyria begins to encroach upon the southern kingdom and at one point threatens to annex the southern kingdom, particularly during the days of King Hezekiah. And when we get to Isaiah 36 onwards, which is also mirrored in Second Kings, you have Sennacherib's invasion, and here we are told that Sennacherib wants to basically do the same thing with the southern kingdom that his predecessors did with the northern kingdom. And Isaiah comes to King Hezekiah and tells him that um, that the Lord will fight on their side. And eventually, what happens is that an angel strikes down the Assyrian army, and um, Sennacherib returns to Assyria. Now, this particular episode is actually attested outside of the Bible. So, in Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts, there's a reference to um, a victory stela that was set up by King Sennacherib, where he is said to have conquered a bunch of cities in Judah, and at one point, it mentions that he has Hezekiah under his submission and has him shut up like a bird in his cage. Um, so here you have some references to Hezekiah. And here we read Sennacherib's exploits. I laid waste the large district of Judah and made the overbearing and proud Hezekiah its king bow in submission. Later on it says, I laid waste the large district of Judah and put the straps of my yoke upon Hezekiah its king. So Hezekiah tells us that he did in fact invade Judah and threaten Hezekiah, but it doesn't mention that Sennacherib was forced back into Assyria and his invasion was ultimately unsuccessful. There's a tendency of a lot of ancient Near Eastern kings to do things like this. They'll mention their victories, but they won't mention their defeats. We only know about his defeat because of the book of Second Kings and the book of Isaiah. A little later, you have the rise of Babylon, and during Hezekiah's day, Babylon was a minor tributary state that was a vassal of Assyria. But in chapter 38 and 39, it is mentioned that the Babylonians actually sent envoys to Hezekiah. So in chapter 39, verse 1, it says, At that time, Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. So, and then, long story short, Hezekiah shares a little too much with them. Isaiah says, You shouldn't have done that. Your sons will be taken away into captivity by Babylon. And then Hezekiah, being a little bit short-sighted, says the following. And then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, for he thought, There will be peace and security in my days. Sounds like a lot of politicians. Who cares what happens after I'm no longer in power, as long as my reign is good? Now, this gets into the question of how much of this actually goes back to the time of Isaiah. As we'll see later, this is important data when we consider this Deutero-Isaiah theory or the Trito-Isaiah theory. Before that, I want to make a brief mention of textual criticism of this book. So Isaiah is a well preserved book. So we do have, aside from the Masoretic text, we have multiple copies of it in the Septuagint. And the Septuagint version of Isaiah largely mirrors the Masoretic version. It differs from it in only a few minor places. And a lot of the places appear to be translational issues rather than textual issues. It would seem that the Septuagint translators of Isaiah had some very interesting word choices in a few places, especially Isaiah 7:14. A lot of ink has been spilled over Septuagint's choice to render the Hebrew word Alma as Parthenos, and that will require a lengthy conversation when we get there. But other than that, there isn't a lot of significant differences in the Septuagint version. Very interestingly, this book is also preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the 1Q Isaiah 1A and 1Q Isaiah B. So we have two major scrolls of Isaiah among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the first of the two is particularly prominent because it is one of the earliest and best preserved copies of Isaiah that we have. It's known as the Great Isaiah Scroll. So if you Google around, you can actually find screenshots and photographs of the Great Isaiah Scroll. Um, and it is remarkable how much of our current um, text of Isaiah matches the um, version that we find in Dead Sea Scrolls. That doesn't mean that they completely match. There will be a few variants here and there, a few consonantal differences, um, but a lot of it is mostly differences in spelling. There are things that don't particularly affect the meaning of the text, and a lot of the key passages, such as Isaiah 53, are intact. So, the Great Isaiah Scroll is a great witness that we have to the preservation of one of the largest and most theologically rich passages or books of the Hebrew Bible. And from that, we can have great confidence that the text of Isaiah, as we have it, has been preserved down to the present day. Now let's dive into the issue of authorship. So, as most people who have studied Isaiah know, it is commonplace to speak of multiple authors of Isaiah. And contrary to what a lot of people might think, this is actually a much older theory than you may realize. Because even as early as the time of the Talmud, in Baba Bathra, it's mentioned that the text of Isaiah as we have it was redacted during the days of Hezekiah. And if it was redacted during the days of Hezekiah, that would imply that there's more than one hand at work in the final composition of the text. But the multiple Isaiah theory, as we have it today, began in the 18th century when a number of German scholars noted that there is an apparent break in theme between chapters 1 to 39 and chapters 40 to 66 of the book. And they posited that the chapters 40 onwards was composed by a later author writing in Isaiah's name who was living during the time of the Babylonian exile, presumably around the time of the rise of the Persians, hence the references to Cyrus. And he wanted to back project his work to pre-exilic times. Now, this theory has been further modified because later scholars have posited that chapters 55 onwards were part of a third Isaiah who wrote even later than second Isaiah and wanted to add his own concerns to the final composition of the book. And then the theory further gets modified by people who see evidences of a later hand in First Isaiah. So remember, we mentioned chapters 1 through 39 is First Isaiah. Well, not quite, because there are references to Babylon and other later empires in First Isaiah. So a number of scholars who do not believe in predictive prophecy have posited that those references must be the work of a later hand that inserted them into First Isaiah to make them look pre-exilic. So the predominant theory that we have among Old Testament scholars right now is that the book of Isaiah, as we have it today, is a hodgepodge of multiple texts, usually 3, 4, or more, and they were ultimately unified into a single composition by the time we get to the earliest text that we have of Isaiah, which in this case would be the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, this theory is not without its challengers. There are a number of people who continue to hold to traditional authorship long after this theory gained acceptance. So I think, for example, of Gleason Archer, whose Old Testament survey I have here. He devotes 2 whole chapters of this to refuting the multiple Isaiah theory. And you also have Petrie and Bergsma's Old Testament survey, where Petrie and Bergsma mention a number of arguments in favor of the first one Isaiah theory. So the belief that all of Isaiah comes from one author. So if you go to the section here, difficulties with the theory of multiple authorship. Petrie and Bergsma are some of the leading conservative Catholic voices in favor of one Isaiah. So the prophet wrote all of the book. So who's right? Is there one Isaiah or are there multiple Isaiahs? So, spoiler alert, I believe that there is only one Isaiah. But in order to do justice to this theory, we need to talk about the arguments for and against. Okay, so the reasons for believing in multiple Isaiahs are that, first of all, we have to divide the multiple Isaiah proponents into two camps. So there are those who deny predictive prophecy and those who affirm predictive prophecy. So one of the caricatures that one Isaiah proponents have of multiple Isaiah proponents is that um, the the only reason someone might posit multiple Isaiahs is because they deny predictive prophecy. And I've been guilty of this myself in the past. Now, there is a kernel of truth to this. Many of the main proponents of the theory in the 18th and 19th centuries were deniers of predictive prophecy, and that was one of the major arguments that they held. But this does not mean that every proponent of it is a denier of predictive prophecy. So there are some who believe that Isaiah has bona fide prophetic predictions, especially of the Messiah. But they do not believe that references to Cyrus and Deutero-Isaiah are examples of predictive prophecy. And one of the arguments they would say is, well, if you read the references to Isaiah, in fact, let's go over there right now. It's not framed as a predictive prophecy. So let's start in Isaiah 44:24 and go up to 45:1. Thus says the Lord your Redeemer, who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself, who frustrates the signs of liars, and makes fools of diviners, who turns wise men back, and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant, and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I'll raise up their ruins, who says to the deep, be dry, I'll dry up your rivers, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. Now, those who hold to multiple Isaiahs, yet affirm predictive prophecy, would argue that this is not a predictive prophecy because it's not framed as a predictive prophecy. They'll say, if you read it, it's not saying this is something that's going to happen in the future. Now, personally, I don't find this a particularly strong argument because you can argue that just because something isn't framed as happening in the future doesn't mean it's not a future prophecy. In fact, we have hints that this is a future prophecy elsewhere in the Old Testament. So if you look at Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we read the following. So remember we went through Ezra several episodes ago. So let's look at this together, shall we? In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Now, this is interesting. According to Cyrus, the Lord told him to build his house. Now, where does that happen? Well, Jeremiah appears to have spoken of it, and we'll talk about that when we get to Jeremiah. But also, look at this. Let's go back to Isaiah 44:28. He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. So it would appear that Cyrus has read this text already. Well, that's interesting. How could he have read a text if it was still to be written in his day? It would make more sense if we were to suppose that this text already existed when Cyrus had reigned, and he was aware of this prophecy. And in fact, in Josephus' Antiquities, this connection is made explicit. So let's look up the Antiquities of the Jews, shall we? Um, the works of Flavius Josephus. Um, I should have had this up earlier. But if you look at the works of Josephus, he mentions the fact that Cyrus read the scroll of Isaiah and actually saw the prophecy of himself in it. And this is what led to him to do what he did. All right, here it is. So in Josephus' Antiquities, it says, thus, the first of Cyrus is the 70th of the Jewish captivity, and this twice repeated. In the same place, Josephus says that from Isaiah, who foretold Cyrus by name. Okay, so this is actually the preface. All right, it is in book 11, chapter 1. In the first year of the reign of Cyrus, which was the 70th from the day that our people were removed out of their own land into Babylon, God commiserated the captivity and calamity of these poor people according as he has foretold to them by Jeremiah the prophet before the destruction of the city, that after they had served Nebuchadnezzar and his posterity, and after they had undergone that servitude 70 years, he would restore them again to the land of their fathers. Now, let's go a little bit further in paragraph 2. This was known to Cyrus by his reading the book which Isaiah left behind him of his prophecies. For this prophet said that God had spoken thus to him in a secret vision. My will is that Cyrus, whom I have appointed to be king over many and great nations, send back my people to their own land and build my temple. This was foretold by Isaiah 140 years before the temple was demolished. Accordingly, when Cyrus read this and admired the divine power, an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written. So he called for the most eminent Jews that they were in Babylon and said to them that he gave them leave to go back to their own country and to rebuild their city Jerusalem and the temple of God. So according to Josephus, the reason why Isaiah returned the Jews to their own land was because he read a prophecy about himself in Isaiah. Now, this isn't a slam dunk in favor of second Isaiah being pre-exilic, but it does show that it was being read as a predictive prophecy as far back as the days of Josephus. Now, we can look from that to some of the arguments for 1 Isaiah. So, as I mentioned, the main reason was that there is a thematic difference between 1st and 2nd Isaiah. So a lot of people who hold to multiple Isaiahs mention this as their main reason. Against that, Petrie and Bergsma have pointed out that 1st and 2nd Isaiah are a lot more unified than proponents of the theory are willing to admit. So here in their Old Testament introduction, they show a number of unified themes across the book of Isaiah. So Petrie and Bergsma write, as a number of recent studies have shown, there are a remarkable number of similarities of diction and theme that run through the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd portions of Isaiah, so that one can speak about a real unity to the final form of the book. In the words of Walter Brueggemann, 2nd Isaiah theologically is seen to be organically derived from 1st Isaiah, and then they name a number of those themes. So you have Jerusalem as a daughter of Zion, the bride of the Lord. The future law goes forth from Zion to the Gentiles. The gathering of Israel and Gentiles to God's mountain. The wolf and lamb lie together. God pours out the Spirit on the future king. There are oracles against Babylon in both sections, which is interesting because 1st Isaiah is pre-Babylonian. And then the arm of the Lord brings judgment and salvation. And Petrie and Bergsma go on to state, in light of these and other parallels across the book of Isaiah, scholars such as John Oswald conclude From chapter 1 to chapter 66, the various parts of the present book all reflect the other parts. Of course, it's possible to explain such parallels as the result of 2nd Isaiah knowing of and consciously imitating 1st Isaiah, but such admissions once again have the effect of weakening the argument to multiple authors based on the differences between the parts of the book. So, in other words, the two Isaiahs are quite unified. Now, a few other arguments are worth noting. So, one argument that is mentioned in Gleason Archer's Old Testament survey is the fact that um, in the references to 2nd Isaiah to the geography that he knows of, he betrays a lot more knowledge of Palestinian geography than Babylonian geography, which would not make sense if 2nd Isaiah was writing um, in the Babylonian exile. It makes perfect sense if it was written at the time when the Judahites were still living in the Promised Land. So I'm going to quote a paragraph from Gleason Archer in page 375 of his Old Testament survey, and he says this. A most important criterion for dating ancient documents is found in those references or allusions to contemporary events or surrounding conditions which it happened to contain. The geographical setting which it presupposes, the kind of plants and animals which it mentions, the climatic conditions which it implies as prevailing in the author's own environment, all these are important data for determining the place and time for the composition of any document, whether ancient or modern. A careful examination of such allusions in Isaiah 44 to 66 points unmistakably to the conclusion that it was composed in Palestine rather than in Babylon. And then he mentions a little bit more. Isaiah 40 to 66 shows little knowledge of Babylonian geography, but great familiarity with that of Palestine. Thus, the trees referred to are not found in Babylonia, but are native to Palestine, such as the cedar, cypress, and oak. The writer's geographical viewpoint is clearly Palestinian. Thus, Yahweh is said to send off his decree to Babylon. Israel is called the seed of Abraham, which the Lord has taken from the ends of the earth. The same is true for the phrases from the east and from a far country as employed in 46:11, and from thence rather than from hence in 52:11. An exhortation to the future exiles to leave Babylon, so as the invitation has been given them by the coming deliverer Cyrus. So, in other words, according to Gleason Archer, if you read chapters 40 to 66, it is written by someone who appears to be living in Palestine. And this lends credence to Deutero-Isaiah being pre-exilic in character, and I would argue being written by the prophet Isaiah himself. And one other major argument, there are many other arguments that I can mention, but I don't want to belabor the point, is that the language of 2nd and 3rd Isaiah is early biblical Hebrew, the same type of Hebrew that was used before the exile, as opposed to late biblical Hebrew. So a very important article published in the Westminster Theological Journal of all the 1996 volume is dating Isaiah 40 to 66. What does the linguistic evidence say? And this is by Mark Rooker. Those who are looking at the screen can see the title there. And this is one of the more underrated articles that show that Isaiah 40 to 66 has all the earmarks of having been written before the exile. So I think I mentioned in some past episodes that one of the ways you can date a book in the Hebrew Bible is to look at the type of Hebrew that's contained in it. So we do what is known as a diachronic study of Hebrew. So diachronic means through time in Greek, and it's the idea that language evolves. And you know this even from English. If you read a Shakespearean text, it reads very different from a novel that was composed within the last century, the last decade even. The type of English is very different. And when you read Shakespeare, you know right away this was not written in the 21st century. More likely it was written in the 16th century. Same with the King James Version. It's written in a type of English that would have prevailed in the 16th and 17th century, but nobody speaks that way anymore today, unless they're trying to um, sound that way. I know some preachers who like their these and thous, so they will say these and thous, but in everyday language, we don't talk like that anymore. Similar to Hebrew, Hebrew has changed a lot over the centuries, and it changed a lot, particularly during the exilic period, such that books that were composed during or after the exile sound different from books that were composed before the exile. Um, and what Rooker does is he looks at a number of words, phrases that occur in Isaiah, and he compares them with a number of pre and post exilic books to see which they match more. And I'll give you a couple of examples here, okay? So the first one that he mentions is the use of the Hebrew words for kingdom. So there are actually two words for kingdom in Hebrew. There's mamlacha and then there's malkut. And if you look at a number of words, number of books in pre-exilic times, such as the books of First and Second Samuel, they prefer the word mamlacha. So mamlacha is the older Hebrew word. Whereas if you look at later books such as the Chronicles, they prefer the word malkut. And in fact, a lot of parallel passages between Samuel and Chronicles or Kings and Chronicles, one book will mention mamlacha while the other will say malkut, even if everything else about the book is the same. So let's compare, shall we? 2 Samuel 7:12, where it says, Ve hakimoti et mamlachto, in English, and I will establish his kingdom. The parallel passage is in 1 Chronicles 17:11, where it says, V'hakimoti et malkuto. And it's the same in English, I will establish his kingdom. And if you're just reading the English translation, you would never pick up on this. But the underlying Hebrew word is different. Samuel uses mamlaka, whereas Chronicles mentions malkut. And the preference for malkut is an indication that there has been a shift. Now, an interesting note is Ezekiel, which was written during the exilic period, which seems to use both. Um, and we'll see more examples of this Ezekiel as sort of like a transitional book, which uses some pre-exilic and some post-exilic terminology. So keep this in mind. Pre-exilic books prefer mamlacha, post-exilic books prefer malkut. Which word does Isaiah use? So I'm gonna blow up the left-hand side. So let's take a look at how it uses the word kingdom. Now, there are exactly three places where the word kingdom appears. Actually, there are exactly two places where the word kingdom appears in Juro and Trito Isaiah. So the first is in Isaiah 47, verse 5, where it says, Sit in silence and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms. Shvi dumam uvoi v'choshek bat kasdim, ki lo tosifi yikra'u lach geveret mamlachot. So mamlachot. So as you can see, Deutero Isaiah is using the old Hebrew word for kingdom, not the new kingdom, the new word for kingdom. So he's used mamlaka. Now, how about Trito Isaiah? In chapter 60, verse 12, it says, For the nation and the kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid waste. Kim hagoy ve hamamlacha asher lo ya'avduch yovedu ve hagoyim charov yecheravu. So you can see here, mamlacha again is used. So both Deutero and Trito Isaiah use mamlacha instead of malkut, and this is evidence that it is written in a pre-exilic time. Now, There are other examples that we can use. One has to do with the way David or David is spelt. So Rooker mentions this as another example. So here you can see how there are two ways to spell David in Hebrew. One has a yod on it, and one does not have a yod on it. So this is what you call a plane spelling in biblical Hebrew. They will add a yod to emphasize that it is a long I sound, whereas older Hebrew may not necessarily show it. The tendency in Hebrew is to have more plane spellings later on. So the exact same passage um, between Samuel and or Kings and Chronicles will show variant spellings. So here you have in 1 Samuel 7:26 you have David spelled without a yod. The exact same passage in 1 Chronicles 17:24 has David spelled with a yod. 1 Kings 7:51, once again, you have David without a yod, and the parallel passage, 2 Chronicles 5:1, shows David with a yod. And then you have the interesting case of Ezekiel, written during the exile, where David is mentioned 4 times, and 3 times there is no yod, and 1 time there is a yod, which shows that there is a transition taking place. Now, how about Isaiah? How does Isaiah spell David? There is only one mention of David in 2nd or 3rd Isaiah, and that's in Isaiah 55, verse 3, where it says, "Incline your ear and come to me, hear that your soul may live, and I'll make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David." And if you look here, look at that. David is spelled without a yod. So Isaiah, so this is a very limited sample size because there's only one instance of it, but it's significant nonetheless that the one time that David is mentioned in the 2nd or 3rd Isaiah, depending on who you ask, it's spelt without the way older writers spell it. And one last example that Rooker mentions, there's a bunch of other ones. The preferred word for the verb to gather. So let's go down. So in older Hebrew, there are 2 verbs for to gather, kavach and asaf. And you'll see examples of that, for example, in Genesis 29:22, where it says, "Va'esof Lavan et kol anshe hamakom." And Laban gathered all of the men of the place. So Asaph is used there. Contrast with 1 Chronicles 22, where it says, "Vayomer David liknos et ha gerim." And David said to gather the foreigners. So here, kanas is used rather than asaph. Now, where does Isaiah fall there? Well, it is interesting that every single time that 2nd Isaiah uses that has to mention a gathering, it uses the older Hebrew words kavach and asaph. So Isaiah 58:6-8, for example, uses the word kavach. Contrast with Ezekiel 22, which uses kanas, and same with Ezekiel. So according to Rooker, Isaiah 40:66 employs the early biblical Hebrew expression on 22 occasions, 8 times the verb asaph, with kavach occurring 14 times. The later synonym kanas used in Ezekiel is completely absent from Isaiah 40:66. So we can quote Rooker's conclusion, which should be the end of the matter for us. The few examples I've presented are in no way unique, but are consistent with other features which likewise point in this same direction. But it should be emphasized that where diachronic comparison can be made based on the present state of diachronic research, Ezekiel from the exilic period as well as post-exilic Hebrew literature always indicates later linguistic features than those we find in Isaiah 40-66. Thus, if critical scholars continue to insist that Isaiah should be dated in the exilic or post-exilic period, they must do so in the face of contrary evidence from diachronic analysis. In layman's terms, Isaiah 40-66 looks like it was composed before the Babylonian exile, and that throws a whole wrench into the whole multiple Isaiah's theory. Now, So based on this, you could see that I'm firmly in the one Isaiah camp. I believe that Isaiah wrote more or less the whole book of Isaiah, and this accords with New Testament usage, where every time the book of Isaiah is quoted, regardless of which part, it's always attributed to the prophet Isaiah. Now, does this mean that I have something against people who hold to multiple Isaiahs? Not necessarily. They're free to hold that opinion. Um, and I think that I wouldn't necessarily accuse them of having an anti supernatural bias, even though maybe some of them do, not all of them, but some. But I would say that based on linguistic and other evidence, we have a fairly clear cut case in favor of one Isaiah. And those who want to have a more in-depth discussion of this, the late Michael Heiser, I should have mentioned this earlier. I derived a lot of research from Michael Heiser's Naked Bible podcast. And in episode 217, he has a whole discussion on this that's over an hour long. It's called The Authorship and Date of the Book of Isaiah. And I'll try to have a link to that included for anyone who wants a more in-depth study of this. But let's shift gears to the theological themes of Isaiah. So, what is Isaiah concerned about? So, there is no way to cover every possible theme that occurs in the book of Isaiah. So, I won't talk about eschatology, for example, even though there's a lot of eschatology in the book. But I want to look at a few especially significant themes if we're going to talk about the practical side as well as the apologetic side. So, one of the major concerns of Isaiah is to mention that we should always trust in the Lord. So, Isaiah is constantly arguing against people who uh, want to, against the kings of Judah who want to ally with foreign nations, especially Egypt. So, Egypt comes up quite a bit in Isaiah because this was a period where there were two major imperial powers in the region. You have Assyria and you have Egypt. And the perennial temptation was to side with Egypt against Assyria. Think of it like the Cold War, where the whole world was divided between those that sided with NATO and the United States and those that sided with Russia and the Warsaw Pact. And then you have the Third World, which was not aligned with either. According to Isaiah, um, we should not fall into the trap of supporting the lesser of two evils. So, as bad as Assyria might be, it does not justify siding with Egypt. Remember what Egypt did to the Hebrews way back in Exodus, for example, or more recently, how they invaded Judah during the time of Rehoboam. So, Isaiah 31 states, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. And yet he is wise and brings disaster, and he does not call back his words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers and work against the helpers of those who work iniquity. The Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and he who is helped will fall, and they will all perish together." In other words, don't rely on Egypt. Egypt seems tempting, but they will fail you in the end. Instead, trust in the Lord. So we can learn from this that, um, as tempting as it is to rely on political powers, we should not lean too heavily on them because even they will disappoint. And even then, the your lesser of two evils may end up backfiring on you. This is repeated in Isaiah 37, where Assyria invades, and the Rabshakeh actually taunts Hezekiah and says, um, let me see, Isaiah 37, verses 4 to 6. Do I have the right reference here? I think it's 36, actually. There you go. 36, 4 to 6. And the Rabshakeh said to them, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you trust that you rebelled against me? Behold, you are trusting in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him." So Rabshakeh saying, "Ha! We're better than Egypt. We'll beat them if you try to trust in them." And then he tries to say that you can't trust in the Lord either, but that doesn't pan out because the Lord ends up wasting the Assyrians. And related to this is the theme of not relying on the idols. So this is a particular um, theme in Second Isaiah. And in fact, this is one of the arguments for why a lot of people believe that Second Isaiah is actually the same as the prophet Isaiah, because um, idolatry was a major concern during the time before the exile, but it wasn't a major threat during and after the exile, because at that point, Israel, or the Jews rather, had strengthened their resolve to be staunch monotheists. Um, in Isaiah 40, verse 18 and 20, it says, "To whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? An idol, a craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and casts for it silver chains. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move." Saying, so basically, God is saying, you are a fool if you trust in idols, because they're made of man-made materials and they cannot help you. And then later on, he will speak about the fact that he can do things that none of these idols can do, such as declare the future or deliver his people. Isaiah 43, verses 9 onward says, "All the nations gather together and the people assemble. Who among them can declare this and show us the former things? Let them bring their witnesses to prove them right, and let them hear and say, it is true. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me. I am the Lord, and besides me there is no Savior. I declared and saved and proclaimed, when there was no strange God among you, and you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and I am God, and also henceforth I am He. There is none who can deliver from my hand. I work, and who can turn it back?" So there's this theory that some critical scholars hold, that the development of Israelite religion from henotheism to monotheism took place around the time of Isaiah. So this is the point where the Israelites really started believing that there is only one God. Now, I don't hold to that theory. Benjamin Sommer, in his book Bodies of God, has a whole appendix explaining that Israel was always monotheistic, even in pre-exilic times. But here um, you can see evidence that, yeah, at the time of Isaiah, they definitely already held to a firm monotheism. And then finally, you have the idea of the servant of the Lord. This is a good transition to the next major thing we're going to talk about, which is messianic prophecy. There are 4 servant songs in the book of Isaiah. You have Isaiah 42, 1 to 4, 49, 1 to 6, 54 to 11, and then 52, 13 to 53, 12. And these servant songs speak of a certain figure known as the servant, who is God's instrument of salvation for the nations. And there is a lot of debate as to who exactly this servant is. But as we will soon see, these become some of the most prominent messianic prophecies in Isaiah and the whole Hebrew Bible. So this, now we can talk about messianic prophecy. So your seatbelts. And because of time constraints, we won't talk about every single messianic prophecy, because Isaiah is full of them. And honestly, talking about messianic prophecy in Isaiah, you could write entire books just on that topic. So I'm only going to do a cursory overview. If anyone wants an in-depth discussion of the messianic prophecies in Isaiah from a apologetic standpoint, I would highly recommend the Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus series by Michael Brown, specifically um, volume 3. So, those who can see the screen, I have the title here. So, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. The third volume is subtitled Messianic Prophecy Objections. And as you can see from the table of contents, a large chunk of it focuses on the book of Isaiah in particular, and then a little bit on Daniel and the Psalms as well. But the majority of the book focuses on Isaiah because of how many um, prophecies are contained therein. So I'm going to try to summarize some of the arguments. For those who want in-depth discussion, grab this book by Michael Brown. Um, and let's put that to the side um, for now. And let's look at a few of the most prominent um, passages. So the first one is Isaiah 7:14. So I'm going to have two major translations open. So you have the ESV Catholic edition, and then you have the new JPS Tanakh, which is one of the most popular Jewish translations of the Bible. So if you want to see how Jewish people will translate this book, we can use this as our benchmark. So Isaiah 7, verse 14, it states, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." So in the JPS Tanakh, it says, "Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel." So there are two major issues that come up in this book. One has to do with translation, and one has to do with the context. So let's begin with the translation. Okay, so here there are two opposite tendencies that we need to avoid. The first one, which is what a lot of anti-missionaries, anti-Christian skeptics like to say, is that virgin here is a mistranslation. It is illegitimate to translate this as virgin, and the fact that it's translated that way in Christian translations is evidence of theological bias. Um, and and you can see this in the way a lot of contemporary translations render this. The JPS is not alone in using young woman. You'll also see this same translation in a number of even Christian translations. So let's use the New American Bible as one of our prominent examples. Isaiah 7 14 in the New American Bible uses the young woman. Okay, so they're trying to avoid the theological bias, quote unquote. And the same with the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. It uses young woman, once again, trying to avoid the theological bias. Now, a lot of Christian apologists, in their zeal to defend the traditional translation of this text, will tend to fall into another error on the other side, which is that the Jews corrupted the text. They will argue that, oh, well, you see, it's supposed to say virgin, but the Masoretic text, it was corrupted. You can't trust it when it says young woman. And this particular argument is actually very old. It goes all the way back to St. Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And it has a long pedigree among a lot of traditional Christians who will argue that the reason the Hebrew text doesn't say virgin is because the Jews tampered with it. And I am here to tell you that that argument is also wrong. There are a number of reasons why that falls flat. And here are a few of the reasons why we can't use that argument against the Jews. So first of all, it's not the Masoretic text by itself. If you look at Isaiah 7:14 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's the word used for young woman or virgin here, it's Alma. So you can see here that the same word in the Masoretic text is used the in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now it gets further complicated when we start considering the Septuagint. Okay, so you can see here in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, where it says, because of this, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the Parthenos will conceive in the womb and will bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel. So the common belief is that Parthenos is the word for virgin, but it gets a little bit complicated because, as I will show you, that's not always the case. In Genesis chapter 34, we have the rape of Dinah. Okay, Dinah is the daughter of Jacob. So it says here, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob, came out to observe the daughters of the natives. And Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Horite, the ruler of the land, saw her, and taking her, he slept with her and violated her. So he took her virginity in verse 2. Now watch this. And he paid attention to the life of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the Parthenos, if you look at the Septuagint, and he spoke to her according to the mind of the maiden. So Parthenos can mean virgin, but it doesn't always mean virgin. So even the Septuagint's word for virgin doesn't always mean virgin. So saying that the Jews corrupted the text would just as easily be used against the Septuagint as it would the Masoretic text. So how are we to deal with this issue? So the answer is that, okay, so we believe that this is a prophecy of the virgin birth. But our belief that this is a prophecy of the virgin birth does not depend on what specific Hebrew word is used in this verse. Rather, it depends on the context in which the word is used. So here is where we dive into the weeds a little bit, okay? So first of all, in Hebrew, there are two words that are often translated as virgin. The first one is Alma, which is what we see here. Now, it can be translated as virgin, but it doesn't always mean virgin. There are a lot of places where it is used in a sense that it is not referring to a virgin. Okay, but most of the time it is. In fact, the main idea behind Alma is not so much virginity as it is youth or maidenhood. So the general assumption is that a young maiden is a virgin, but obviously that's not always the case. Now, a lot of critics of Christianity will argue, well, if Isaiah wanted to convey that the woman here is a virgin, he could have used the word betula. So betula is the other word that it's often translated as virgin, and that does mean that it should be translated as virgin. Well, guess what? That's not always the case either, because sometimes betula is used in a sense that it is not a virgin. And if you want to see an example of that, let's turn to Isaiah chapter 47. Okay, my thing is, I'm getting a little bit of a glitch here. Excuse me just a moment while I fix this. Okay, so let's turn to Isaiah 47, and my thing will cooperate. There we go. So in this verse, it says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called tender and delicate." So here you have the word virgin. So in the English, and here it says betula. So Radi ushvi al afar betulat bat Bavel. So is Babylon a virgin here? Well, let's go down a little bit. Verse 8 and 9. All right. So in verses 8 and 9 it says, "Now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. These two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantments. So, according to uh, this chapter, Babylon is a wife and a mother. Otherwise, she can't have widowhood or loss of children. But that creates problems if you believe that Betula always means virgin, because in this context, Betula does not mean virginity. Otherwise, this text would not make sense. So, what have we learned so far? Alma can mean virgin, but doesn't always mean virgin. Betula more often means virgin, but still doesn't always mean virgin. And Parthenos, the Greek word, can often mean virgin, but does not always mean virgin. So, in other words, neither Hebrew nor Greek have a word that means virgin 100% of the time. Hebrew and Greek have words whose semantic domain includes the concept of virginity, and they tend to overlap with each other, and sometimes they are used interchangeably. So that much we can establish. So is Isaiah 7:14 referring to a virgin the way we think about it? Well, yes and no. This is where it gets complicated. So one of the features of Old Testament prophecy is they tend to have multiple fulfillments. And here, the sign in question is meant to be for King Ahaz, who is asking for help from the Israelite and Syrian invasion. So the sign is meant to be a sign of deliverance, because in verses 15 and 16 it says, "He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted." So this goes into the second objection that a lot of critics of Christianity will say, well, if you look at the context, this isn't about a future messianic king hundreds of years from thence, because that can't help King Ahaz. It has to be something within his lifetime. This ignores the fact that a lot of messianic prophecies have multiple fulfillments. Now, if the only thing that this is referring to is a young maiden having a kid, now what kind of a sign is that? That happens all the time. So this is a sign is meant to be something miraculous, something that can't possibly be explained by merely natural means. And you know, the a young maiden having a child, okay, whoopie doo. Now the the Syrians and the Israelites being defeated and sent packing. Now that's a little bit more amazing. But even then, it's not exactly the sort of thing that that would convey a wow. There's no way that ordinary human powers could have done that. Because as we will see, actually the reason why Israel and Syria were sent packing was because Assyria came, and shortly thereafter, Israel ceases to be a nation. But in order for this to really be a sign from the Lord, it has to refer to something far beyond the immediate time horizon of the people involved, beyond the time of Isaiah and beyond the time of Ahaz. So this is where the whole multiple fulfillments comes in. It has to have a fulfillment in Ahaz's lifetime, otherwise this is no help to him, and it has to have fulfillment beyond Ahaz's lifetime, otherwise, this isn't really much of a sign. And ultimately, the only way we can reconcile those two is to say that there were two fulfillments, and the second of those two fulfillments is the birth of the Messiah, Jesus. Now, that is how we can resolve Isaiah 7:14. So if you see that your translation of Isaiah 7:14 says the young woman rather than the virgin, don't panic. That doesn't mean that those evil liberals are trying to undermine the faith. It could just be that they're trying to do a delicate balancing act when it comes to the multiple meanings of Alma here. Although personally, I still prefer translations that say virgin. Now, let's go to Isaiah chapter 2, verses chapter 9, verses 2 to 7. And this is a bit of a longer text, so it's important to read all of it. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his for his shoulder and the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So it's a fairly long passage, and there's a lot to unpack here. All right. So a few observations are in order. First of all, it's important that you read starting in verse 2, because verse 2 onwards is the passage that is quoted in the New Testament. So let's pull up Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 onwards. This is Jesus beginning his ministry. Now, when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. For those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. So, according to Matthew here, Jesus beginning his public ministry is a fulfillment of Isaiah 9. Now, this right away is a good answer to one of the first objections that we meet, which is that, well, if this is a prophecy about Jesus, why does verse 6 never get mentioned in the New Testament? If you look in the New Testament, the child passage here in verses 6 and 7 is never quoted in the New Testament, and it's never quoted in the Apostolic Fathers. It takes a while for it to get picked up by Christians. Well, maybe verses 6 and 7 aren't quoted, but verses 1 and 2 are quoted. And one of the features of Matthew in particular is that he will quote the beginning part of a passage with the understanding that the entire passage in which that is contained is being referenced. So think, for example, of the fact that he quotes Psalm 22:1 in the Passion narrative. My God, why have you forsaken me? In so doing, he intends for the entirety of Psalm 22 to refer to that event. In the same way, Matthew quotes the first two verses of Isaiah 9 with the understanding that in so doing, he is also applying the rest of this pericope all the way up to verse 7. Matthew could have chosen to quote the entire pericope all the way up to verse 7, but he is speaking to a predominantly Jewish audience that is already familiar with these prophecies. So quoting just the beginning of the passage will suffice for them. Now, a few other objections raised by rabbinic Jews and skeptics is that, well, this isn't a messianic prophecy, because if you look at the Hebrew, it's not framed in the future tense. So this is where, let's get into a little bit of Hebrew, shall we? I'm going to quote verse 5 in Hebrew for you, okay? Ki yeled yulad lanu benitan lanu v'thi hamisra al shichmo v'ikra shmo pele yoetz el gibor aviad sar shalom. So the verbs that appear in here are all in the what you call the perfect aspect. So yeled yulad lanu. So yulad is what you call perfect. And then nitan is also in the perfect. And then you have vaikra. which is a vaiktol. Those of you who've been following my biblical Hebrew series already know this. Now, what gets lost on a lot of critics who raise this argument is that the Nevi'im in particular, so that's the prophetic books, are fond of what is known as the prophetic perfect, which is that they will refer to a future occurrence as if it had taken place in the past. So they will use the perfective text tense, or they'll use the vaiktol form, even though those are typically reserved for past events, because in the mind of the prophet, these events are so certain that you could speak of them as though they had already happened, which is why sometimes the perfect aspect in Hebrew is used to refer to future events. There are many other examples of that throughout the Nevi'im. Needless to say, people who are using this argument, they either don't know Hebrew very well, or they're very selective about what elements of Hebrew grammar they want to appeal to, which is not the most um, honest thing to do, to say the least. Now, how do Jewish people deal with Christian interpretations of this passage? There are two ways that this has been used among the Jews. Um, One way that they will use this is that they will say that, well, this is not a messianic prophecy at all. It's actually a reference to Hezekiah the king, who is the one to whom the prophet is looking forward. And when Hezekiah comes, there is a golden age for Judah, and that fulfills this passage. Another one is to say that, well, actually, it is a messianic prophecy. Um, and Isaiah has in mind here a child who will be the Messiah, but he's not who the Christians claim he is. Um, and what they'll often do is they'll claim that a bunch of these titles are not actually about the Messiah. They will try to create a um, divide between the two. And you'll see both of these tendencies among different Jewish groups. So I'll just show you what I mean. Let's look at the new JPS. And for comparison, I'm also going to pull up the old JPS, the 1917 edition of the JPS. Um, and I want you to compare the traditional translation with both, okay? So the old JPS, the 1917 edition says, "For a child is born unto us, a son is given unto us, and the government is upon his shoulder, and his name is called Peleoet El Gibor Aviad Sar Shalom." So what the 1917 JPS does is it affirms that these are all references to the child, but they decide that they're not going to translate it. They're just going to transliterate the Hebrew to sort of conceal what it actually means. The new JPS, the 1985 one, says, "For a child has been born to us, a son has been given us, and authority has settled on his shoulders. He has been named the mighty God is planning grace, the eternal Father, a peaceable ruler." So apparently, it's doing the same thing that the 1985 is doing. Sorry, the 1917 is doing, except that they actually tried to translate it, but they tried to turn it into a whole phrase. Um, so if you look at the Hebrew, um, you kind of can, if you really squint at it, you can kind of sort of read it that way, but it's really unnatural. The natural way to read this is that actually it is referring to it's a list of titles that the child is going to be called all these things, which leads us to one of the other ways that Jews have tried to diffuse this passage, which is to create an artificial divide among the titles. And this is an old tactic that was used all the way back during the Tanaitic period. So, for those unfamiliar with Jewish history, the Tanaim were the Jewish sages that lived in the second and early third century, and they were responsible for codifying a lot of what would later be placed in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was composed right around the end of the Tanaitic period in the early third century. One of the key figures among the Tanaim was Yonatan ben Uziel. He was a rabbi who wrote a Targum. A Targum is an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it's interesting when you look at Jonathan's Targum, because Targums are usually paraphrases with commentary. And what will often happen here is that he will mention the word Messiah even when the Messiah isn't explicitly mentioned in the text that he's quoting. So if you look, those who can look at the screen, I've highlighted the word Mashiach, which is the Aramaic word Messiah, and it occurs 21 times in Targum Jonathan. 8 of those times are in the book of Isaiah. And of those 8 instances, one of them is in Isaiah 9:5. So it says here, Lana we kavel, sorry, should go a little above that. Amar Navi Levet David Are Rave Ati It Yaled Lana Var It Yahev Lana Wokavel Orata Alohi Lamitra Wa It Kri Shmea Min Kadam Mafli Etsa Laha Givara Kayam Almaya Mashicha Di Shlama Yisge Lana Be Yamohi. So, sorry, my Aramaic is a little rusty, but there is an English translation of this in Samuel Levy's The Messiah, an Aramaic interpretation. So, Levy's translation has it this: the prophet announced to the house of David that a boy has been born unto us, a son has been given unto us, who has taken the Torah upon himself to guard it, and his name has been called by the one who gives wonderful counselor, the mighty God, he who lives forever, Messiah, in whose day peace shall abound for us. So, according to Targum Jonathan, this is a messianic passage. The Messiah is the child in question. However, the titles, Peleo Etz, El Gibor, and Sar Shalom are not references to the child. It's references to the one naming the child. So in the Aramaic, it says, Veit Kari Shemea Min Kadam. So Min Kadam in Aramaic is a phrase that means by or for or through, saying that the one who has these names is naming the child. Unfortunately, that's not what the Hebrew says. You can read it that way, but it's not how a speaker would naturally understand it. And to show you what I mean, I want to pull up Genesis chapter 24, verse, let me see, what's the passage? It's the one where the birth of Esau and Jacob, and I believe it's in Genesis 25, actually. Okay, all right, there is the one that I was looking for. Genesis 25:26. All right. In the JPS, it says, then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Jacob, so they named him Jacob. Sorry, holding on to the heel of Esau, so they named him Jacob. Now let's look at what it says in the Hebrew. All right. So in the Hebrew Bible, it says there, ואחרי כן יצא אחיו וידו אוחזת ביעקב עשיו, ויקרא שמו Yaakov. So look at the phrase ויקרא שמו, and he called his name Jacob. Who's calling his name Jacob? Well, it was his father. Vayikra Shmo does not require an explicit subject. because the subject is already implied in the context. In this case, it is Israel. In the same way, Vaikra Shmo in Isaiah 9:6 does not require an explicit subject because there the implied subject is already um, the people who are naming the child, in which in this case the implied subject is God, because he is the one bequeathing the child. Now, the Targum here wants to have his messianic cake and eat it too. He wants to say that Isaiah 9 is talking about the Messiah, but it's not a divine Messiah the way the Christians say it is. A more recent version of this is to say that El Gibor is mistranslated here. It's not mighty God. You'll hear people say it just means mighty warrior. So Gibor can mean El Gibor can mean like someone with God's strength. The problem with that is that the phrase El Gibor is used one other time in the Hebrew Bible, and that is in Isaiah 10 verses 20 and 21. In that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God, in Hebrew, the El Gibor. So here, Yahweh is El Gibor. So if we cross-reference Isaiah 9, 6 with Isaiah 10:21, we have a pretty clear case that the child in question is not just the Messiah, he is Yahweh himself. So we've got, I believe, 15 minutes. So because of the lack of time, I am going to skip Isaiah 49, even though that would have been an interesting discussion. And I want to look at the most significant of all the messianic passages, which is the fourth and final servant song. That is Isaiah 52:13, 53:12. So apologies if this is getting really detailed, because there is so much to unpack here and I'm only scratching the surface. So let's look at a few details of this passage. So first, in verse 13, it says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted." So high and lifted up gives us a clue as to the identity of the servant. Yarum Venisa. Now, this particular combination of verbs, the verb rum and the verb nasa, occurs a couple of other times in the book of Isaiah, and every single time it is used, it is referring to the Lord. In Isaiah 61, it says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." Who is high and lifted up? It is Yahweh. Now let's look at Isaiah 57:15. "For thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy." So again, Ram Venisa, the same combination of verbs. And who is the one being described? It is Yahweh. So you can see here the two other times that these two verbs are mentioned together in that combination is referring to Yahweh. So when it's being used to refer to the servant, what does that say about the servant in question? He is none other than the Almighty Creator himself. Now, this is actually bolstered by 53:1, where it says, Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" So Zroa Adonai here, Zroa Yahweh, the arm of the Lord. Now, the reference to the arm of the Lord shows up a couple of other times right before this passage, and both of them are important for establishing the context of this verse. So 51:9 and 52:10. Let's go to 51:9, shall we? "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab into pieces, who pierced the dragon?" So arm of the Lord, Zroa Adonai. So the arm of Yahweh here is another way of saying the strength of Yahweh. So the Lord here is the one who is rescuing his people. So to refer to the arm of the Lord is to refer to the Lord himself in a way, or his activity on the earth. So and the other place where he comes up is Isaiah 52. And let's go to that. Isaiah 52:10. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Again, Chasaf Adonai et zro'ah kodsho. So the arm of his holiness. So the Lord is bearing his arm. Well, what does it mean for the Lord to bear his arm? Well, not long after it says, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Apparently, the servant coming is the arm of the Lord being revealed. Who is the servant? Well, let's look at this again. The Lord has bared his only arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. What is the word for salvation in Hebrew? Yeshua. So the Hebrew word Yeshua means salvation. And as we know, Yeshua is also the Hebrew/Aramaic word for Jesus. So you could, if you want to be really messianic, you can say, the Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the Yeshua of our God. Now, this is where we start dealing with some of the anti-Christian objectors to our understanding of this text. So the Jewish objection is that, well, actually, the servant of the Lord is the Jewish people. And you'll see this, and they'll usually refer to Isaiah 49. So I said I wouldn't mention it, but it's worth mentioning in passing. That the servant is identified with Israel in one place. In verse 3 it says, and he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I'll be glorified. And all of the rabbinic Jews are like, see, this is evidence that the servant is Israel. Well, hold on just a second, because in verse 5 it says, and now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I'm honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. So according to this, the servant is going to bring Israel back to the Lord. But how is that the case if the servant is Israel? And it gets even better when you go to Isaiah 53, verse 6, where it says that he will bear the transgressions of his people. Well, who are his people? Israel? Well, how can that be the case? How is Israel bearing the iniquity of Israel? You have this recursive reference that doesn't really make any sense. The way to resolve this is the idea that, well, the servant in one sense is Israel, but it's not all of Israel. It is, as Michael Brown puts it, the righteous remnant of Israel, but more specifically, it's a righteous remnant of one. Because ultimately there is only one Israelite who fully fulfills the law and is able to perfectly embody what Israel is meant to be, and that is the Messiah. Also, think of it in kingly terms. Israel is a monarchy. You have the throne of David. David, in a sense, is Israel. The house of David is the house of Israel. So Israel in this context could mean the Israelite monarchy. It refers to the king who embodies the whole kingdom. It's kind of like how King Charles III is the embodiment of his kingdom, the British Empire and all of its dominions. Wait, the British Empire doesn't exist anymore, never mind. But I'm Canadian, and King Charles is our king. And one could say, in a sense, King Charles is Canada. And in the same way, Israel here could be referring to the Israelite monarch. And it's interesting, if you look at Targum Jonathan again, we're running a little short on time, but I want to get this in. If you look at the ancient Jewish interpretation of this passage, you'll see that a lot of them interpret messianically. Now, the idea that this is referring to Israel collectively did exist at least as far back as the time of Origen, because Origen in Contra Celsus mentions this interpretation existed among some of the Jews, but it wasn't a widespread interpretation. In fact, apart from that one reference in Origen, the next time we encounter this interpretation is from the Jewish rabbi Rashi in the Middle Ages. So that's a gap of several centuries. What about all the other witnesses from that time period? Well, Targum Jonathan, interestingly, says the following. In his reference to Isaiah 52:3, he says, Ha yatzlach avdi meshicha yiram vaisge vaistach vaitkaf lachda. So you can see here, avdi meshicha. According to him, the servant is the Messiah. So Targum Jonathan mentions that this is a messianic passage. Now, Jonathan ben Uziel, of course, this is when Christianity is starting to rise, and he wants to affirm that this is messianic, but he doesn't want to give the Christians any ammunition. So he goes on to translate certain passages idiomatically in such a way that it blunts the force of this admission. So in 53:4-6, we have the following. And he shall seek pardon for our sins, and our iniquities shall be forgiven for his sake, though we are considered stricken, smitten by God, afflicted. Well, what's this we language here? The Hebrew text says that the servant is the one stricken, but here it says the people for whom the servant is seeking pardon are afflicted. So he's playing around with the pronouns because he wants to have his messianic cake and eat it too. And all of this I mentioned in an old article that I wrote a while ago where I respond to Rabbi Tovia Singer. So Singer responds to the Christian use of Targum Jonathan saying, well, Targum Jonathan does say it's the Messiah, but elsewhere he says things that are anti-messianic about this passage, so you can't have it both ways. Well, Targum Jonathan is not a friend to Christians, but he's not a friend to Orthodox Jews either, because he contradicts both. So the best thing to do is to admit that he is in a class of his own. But this, nevertheless, he is a witness that at least some Jews regarded Isaiah 53 as messianic. And God will, I'm going to ask to have the link on the screen. All right, so one last witness. If you look at Targum Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin 98b, it actually mentions that the Messiah is known as the leper scholar, and they say that the reason why the Messiah is called this is because in Isaiah 53, verse 5, let me see. Yeah, it's the whole thing, actually. Verses 4 and 5. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. So the idea is that the Messiah bears physical infirmities on behalf of the people. And they quote this. But in quoting this, they're admitting that this is a messianic passage. So both Targum Jonathan and Talmud Bavli admit that Isaiah 53 is a messianic passage. It's only later on, with Rashi onwards, that this messianic interpretation is expunged from the Judaic consciousness. Because they realize that if you admit that this is the Messiah, it's only a short step from there to admitting that Jesus is the only person who could have fulfilled it. And there are many more things that can be said about this passage. Once again, I refer the reader to Michael Brown's Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. He goes into way much more detail than I ever could. And also look up his debate with Tovia Singer, where he debates with him over the interpretation of this passage. Sorry, Tovia Singer or Michael, the other rabbi. He has a bunch of debates on this passage, and they're all good, and I highly recommend them. Oh yeah, it was Rabbi Shmuley. Now I remember. His debate with Shmuley was also good.
But the main thrust of my argument is that there's good evidence that Isaiah 53 is referring to the Messiah, and we can be confident that the Christian understanding is correct. And I think we're almost out of time. And I believe that Michael mentioned he has to prepare for something else. So, in lieu of the usual Q&A, what maybe we can do is we can ask people to put it in the comments section, and I'll do my best to reply in the comments section. So, Michael, would that be a good way to go about it?
Yeah, that would be excellent.
Yeah.
And
All
glad
right.
that you've
So,
seen those debates too, the Michael
yeah.
Brown debates. I've enjoyed those.
Well, they're great. I think
Yeah.
he does. He's one of the best apologists out there when it comes to refuting Jewish objections to Jesus. So I refer to his
Yeah.
material a lot.
I had him on the show a couple times actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this. Looking forward to the next one. And everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and let us know what you thought about the show there in the comment section. All right. That's going to do it. We'll see y'all later. God bless.
All right.